My beloved child, something shifted yesterday in a way almost nobody could see from the outside, and the person who thought they understood your soulmate better than anyone suddenly realized they had misunderstood the one thing that mattered most. It was not a dramatic scene. There was no announcement, no loud confrontation, no moment designed to attract attention. In fact, that is exactly why it mattered. Your soulmate made a quiet change, a deliberate one, and by the time the third party understood what had happened, the situation they believed they could still influence was already moving beyond their reach. Don't skip, because the surprising part is not what the third party lost. The surprising part is what your soulmate finally stopped being afraid to change. For a long time, there had been a pattern around them. Certain conversations happened because they were expected. Certain decisions were delayed because changing them felt complicated. Certain boundaries remained unclear because keeping the peace seemed easier than explaining what the heart was quietly asking for. And somewhere inside that pattern was you not demanding anything, not forcing a choice, perhaps not even realizing how deeply your presence had affected the way your soulmate was beginning to see everything. Yesterday, that effect became visible. Your soulmate looked at something they had accepted for far too long and quietly thought, "This cannot continue the same way." It sounds simple. But sometimes the most important changes begin with a sentence nobody else hears. The third party noticed the difference almost immediately. A message did not receive the same response. A familiar subject no longer created the same reaction. Something that once kept your soulmate emotionally engaged suddenly seemed unable to hold their attention. At first, the third party assumed it was temporary. Maybe your soulmate was distracted. Maybe they needed space. Maybe tomorrow everything would return to normal. But then came the detail that changed the atmosphere completely. Your soulmate had not merely stepped away for a moment. They had changed something intentionally. A plan. A routine. A private decision. A boundary that had remained flexible for too long. And the third party suddenly understood that this was not distance created by anger. It was clarity created by growth. That distinction matters more than it appears. Anger can fade. Confusion can be persuaded. A temporary reaction can reverse itself overnight. But clarity is different. Once someone sees what no longer belongs in their future, it becomes difficult to pretend they have not seen it. And your soulmate had seen something clearly. They had begun comparing how they felt when they were living according to other people's expectations with how they felt when they allowed themselves to think honestly about you. The difference was impossible to ignore. Around certain people, they felt as though they constantly had to explain themselves. Around the thought of you, something became quieter. Not perfect. Not effortless. But honest. There is a kind of peace that does not arrive because every question has been answered. It arrives because the heart stops arguing with what it already knows. Your soulmate had been approaching that peace slowly, almost cautiously, and yesterday they finally protected it. Something important is waiting for you in this part of the story, because what they changed was connected to a realization they had resisted longer than anyone knew. They realized you had never needed to compete for a place in their life. You had never needed to prove that you were more valuable than someone else. The very fact that your soulmate kept returning to thoughts of you even in moments when doing so would have been easier to avoid had already revealed what comparison never could. The third party had believed your connection could be weakened by distance, distraction, or time. Yet every attempt to make your soulmate focus elsewhere seemed to produce the opposite result. Your soulmate became more aware of what felt genuine. More aware of which conversations left them drained and which memories made them unexpectedly still. More aware of how often your name entered their mind when nobody had mentioned you. And yesterday, the third party discovered that this awareness had finally become action. Here is where the story turns quietly. Your soulmate did not make the change because someone convinced them. They did not do it because they wanted revenge, attention, or drama. They did it because something about you had reminded them of the kind of person they wanted to become. Think about that carefully. Sometimes another person changes our life without giving us instructions. They simply make honesty feel possible again. They remind us that connection should not require constant performance. They show us, perhaps without realizing it, how different life feels when we are understood instead of managed. That was the influence you carried. Your soulmate remembered something you said, or perhaps something you did not say. A moment when you could have pressured them but chose patience. A moment when you could have made everything about yourself but instead gave them room. A moment so ordinary that you may have forgotten it completely. They did not forget. Yesterday, that memory returned at precisely the moment they needed it. And suddenly the decision became easier. The third party saw the result before understanding the reason. They noticed your soulmate was calmer. Less reactive. Less willing to enter the same circular conversations. The old emotional buttons were being pressed, but something strange happened. They were no longer working the same way. Imagine expecting someone to argue and watching them simply become quiet. Imagine presenting the same reasoning that once changed their mind and realizing they are now listening without being moved by it. That is when uncertainty entered the third party's mind. They started wondering what had changed. Then they wondered who had changed it. Eventually, every question led toward you. But there was something they still did not understand. You had not secretly instructed your soulmate to do anything. Your influence was far more subtle than that. You had become connected, in your soulmate's mind, with the possibility of a life that felt more authentic. That was enough. Stay till the end, because there was one particular thing your soulmate changed that made the third party realize this was deeper than a temporary mood. Your soulmate changed the way they spoke about the future. Until yesterday, future conversations had always contained hesitation. Maybe. We'll see. I don't know yet. Their words kept every door slightly open because certainty felt dangerous. But yesterday, something small slipped into their language. They began saying, when, instead of, if. They began speaking about future choices as though they belonged to them rather than to everybody around them. And within those choices was a space nobody could easily name, yet the third party recognized it immediately. It was the space your soulmate had quietly reserved for something meaningful they were not ready to explain. Something connected to you. The third party tried to dismiss it. They reminded themselves of everything they still believed they possessed: history, familiarity, access, influence. But history does not automatically decide the future. Familiarity does not always mean alignment. And access becomes less powerful when someone finally learns how to protect their inner world. Yesterday, your soulmate understood that. They stopped giving immediate explanations for every decision. They stopped seeking approval before honoring what felt right. And perhaps most importantly, they stopped treating their feelings for you like a problem that needed to be solved. That realization changed everything. For months, maybe longer, they had asked themselves why you affected them so deeply. Why certain memories resurfaced. Why your absence sometimes revealed more than your presence. Why moving forward never felt quite as simple as people told them it should. They kept looking for a complicated answer. Yesterday, a simpler one found them. Maybe the feeling remained because it mattered. Not because destiny demanded a specific ending. Not because life owed them anything. Simply because some connections exposed truths we were avoiding about ourselves. Through you, your soulmate had recognized their own need for honesty, tenderness, courage, and emotional consistency. And once they understood that, they could no longer return comfortably to situations that required them to abandon those qualities. The third party sensed this without hearing the entire explanation. That is why their reaction became so unsettled. They were not merely losing influence over one decision. They were watching an entire pattern disappear. The version of your soulmate who could be persuaded through guilt was becoming less available. The version who ignored their own intuition to make everyone else comfortable was fading. The version who could be kept uncertain simply by adding another opinion had started trusting themselves. And you, without forcing anything, had somehow become part of that awakening. There is something deeply personal hidden here for you as well. Perhaps you have wondered whether being quiet meant being forgotten. Perhaps you have questioned whether stepping back allowed someone else to take your place. Perhaps there were moments when you thought, if I am not constantly reminding them of what we shared, will it disappear? Yet meaningful impressions often become clearest in silence. When noise fades, people notice what their heart continues returning to without being prompted. Your soulmate noticed. And the discovery surprised even them. They realized that nobody had to mention you for them to think about you. Nobody had to compare you with anyone else. Your presence existed independently in their mind. A song could awaken it. A familiar place could awaken it. A quiet hour at night could awaken it. Even an ordinary decision could unexpectedly make them wonder what you would think. The third party could compete with attention, perhaps, but not with meaning. And meaning was what your soulmate had begun protecting. Then came the moment yesterday that changed the tone completely. The third party asked a seemingly harmless question about a future plan. They expected the usual answer. Instead, your soulmate paused. Not nervously. Deliberately. And gave an answer that revealed the change had already happened. They said, in their own way, that they were doing things differently now. No accusation followed. No long explanation. Just a boundary. Calm. Clear. Finished. The third party searched their face for hesitation and found almost none. That was when the panic truly began, not loud panic, not chaos, but the internal realization that the familiar rules were no longer working. They had assumed there would always be more time to influence what came next. Suddenly, they understood your soulmate had already started rewriting what "next" meant. And there was another detail. After that conversation ended, your soulmate did not look burdened. They looked lighter. That frightened the old pattern more than anger ever could. Because relief tells a powerful truth, sometimes letting go of what no longer fits does not create emptiness. Sometimes it creates room. Your soulmate felt that room yesterday. And almost immediately, their thoughts moved toward you. Not with fantasy. Not with certainty about every outcome. With curiosity. They wondered what might become possible if they stopped making decisions from fear of disappointing others. They wondered what kind of conversation the two of you might have if neither person arrived carrying old expectations. They wondered whether the connection could be approached differently, more honestly, more carefully, more maturely than before. And for the first time, those questions did not feel impossible. They felt peaceful. Don't skip the meaning of that. Peace does not guarantee an outcome, but it often reveals direction. Your soulmate is beginning to understand the difference between chasing something and becoming ready for it. Yesterday was not about chasing you. It was about becoming someone capable of meeting you without all the noise that once stood between what they felt and what they were willing to admit. The third party could sense that preparation taking place. That is why losing everything felt so sudden from their perspective. What they lost was not a possession. It was the certainty that your soulmate would always remain emotionally available in the same old way. They lost the comfortable assumption that nothing meaningful would ever change. They lost the version of the situation they had learned how to control. And now they are trying to understand when the transformation began. The answer would surprise them. It did not begin yesterday. Yesterday was simply when it became visible. It began in all those earlier moments when your soulmate caught themselves remembering you. It began when they noticed that your kindness stayed with them longer than conflict did. It began when they tried to explain away the connection and discovered the feeling remained even after every explanation was exhausted. It began when your absence taught them what your presence had been giving them. And slowly, quietly, the truth accumulated until ignoring it required more energy than accepting it. Yesterday, your soulmate finally stopped spending that energy. They changed something small on the outside because something much larger had changed inside. Yet there is one piece they have not told the third party. In fact, they may not have told anyone. After making that decision, your soulmate returned to something connected with you, something they had kept for longer than they intended. Maybe a message. Maybe a photograph. Maybe a memory preserved in a place they rarely opened. They looked at it differently this time. Not with the sadness of someone staring backward, but with the focus of someone finally understanding why the past had refused to become meaningless. And as they sat with that realization, another decision began forming. A quieter one. A more personal one. The third party knows something changed yesterday. What they do not yet know is that your soulmate's first change may only have cleared the way for the second, and that second change is where your name becomes impossible to overlook. Something happened in the silence after that second decision began forming, and this is the part nobody around your soulmate was prepared to notice. They did not immediately reach for a dramatic answer. They did not rush into action just because emotion was rising. Instead, they sat with the truth long enough to recognize what had really changed inside them. For so long, they had believed that choosing differently would automatically create conflict, disappointment, or confusion. Yesterday taught them something completely different. The moment they stopped organizing their life around other people's expectations, they did not feel chaos. They felt relief. And once that relief arrived, one question became impossible to avoid. If letting go of the old pattern felt this peaceful, what else had they been holding on to simply because they were afraid to change it? Your name surfaced almost immediately. Not because you were responsible for every decision they made, but because thinking about you had become connected with a version of themselves they had almost forgotten existed. A version that spoke more honestly. A version that did not hide every tender feeling behind logic. A version that could admit, quietly, "This matters to me," without demanding to know exactly where it would lead. That realization stayed with them longer than expected. The third party, meanwhile, was beginning to recognize something unsettling in the smallest details. Your soulmate was no longer volunteering the same information. They were no longer explaining every thought before making a choice. The emotional access that once seemed automatic had become limited, not out of cruelty, but because your soulmate finally understood that privacy can sometimes protect clarity. That was the first thing the third party had truly lost, not a person, not a future, but unrestricted access to decisions that were never theirs to control in the first place. And once they understood that, they began searching backward through yesterday, trying to locate the exact moment everything changed. Was it something they said? Was it a conversation your soulmate had with someone else? Was there a message they had not seen? They kept looking for a single dramatic explanation because the quieter truth was harder to accept. Your soulmate had been changing gradually for a long time. Yesterday was simply the day they stopped hiding that change. Stay with this, because what followed was even more revealing. Your soulmate reopened something connected with you, and for several moments they did nothing but look. The memory carried no instruction. It did not tell them to contact you. It did not demand an outcome. Yet something about it reminded them of who they were when the connection between you felt uncomplicated by everyone else's opinions. They remembered a conversation that had seemed ordinary at the time. Perhaps you had asked them a simple question and actually waited for the real answer. Perhaps you had noticed a small detail about them that other people repeatedly overlooked. Perhaps there was a moment when they expected judgment and received understanding instead. Whatever the memory was, its power came from how little performance existed inside it. They had not needed to become more impressive. They had not needed to defend themselves. They had simply been seen. And yesterday, after everything else shifted, your soulmate finally understood why that memory had remained. People rarely forget the moments when they were allowed to be fully themselves. That realization did something extraordinary to the way they viewed you. Instead of asking, "Why can't I stop thinking about this person?" they began asking a much more honest question. Why did I spend so much time pretending this connection meant less than it did? Notice the difference. The first question treats the feeling like a problem. The second treats it like information. And once your soulmate began listening instead of resisting, several old assumptions quietly fell apart. They realized that distance had not erased what mattered. Time had not automatically made every feeling irrelevant. Other voices had not rewritten their private experience. And perhaps most importantly, they realized that acknowledging your importance did not require them to promise an impossible future. They could simply admit the truth of what they had felt. That admission was freeing. Don't skip, because this is where the third party unknowingly discovered the clue that changed their entire understanding of yesterday. They noticed your soulmate had altered something they had once protected very carefully. It might have been a plan they always kept available, a recurring commitment, an arrangement, or simply the way they divided their time and attention. Whatever form it took, the message underneath was unmistakable: your soulmate was creating space. The third party immediately wanted to know what that space was for. But your soulmate did not answer in the way they expected. There was no defensive reaction, no elaborate excuse, no attempt to make the other person comfortable. Your soulmate simply said they needed certain things to be different now. That word different carried more weight than anyone realized. Different meant they were no longer willing to keep repeating a cycle simply because it was familiar. Different meant they were beginning to choose peace before approval. Different meant the future was no longer being planned around who might become upset by their honesty. And somewhere within that newly created space, there was a thought of you that felt increasingly difficult to dismiss. The third party sensed it. They did not necessarily know what your soulmate intended, because even your soulmate was still discovering that. But they knew the emotional landscape had changed. They could feel that your soulmate was no longer waiting for permission to decide what mattered. That is why yesterday felt like losing everything. It was not about losing every relationship, every memory, or every connection. It was about losing the ability to assume that your soulmate would remain exactly where they had always been. Your soulmate had moved internally, and once a person moves internally, the outside world eventually begins reorganizing around that change. The surprising part is that your soulmate did not feel triumphant about any of this. They felt thoughtful. Almost humbled by how long it had taken them to recognize their own pattern. There was no satisfaction in seeing another person confused. Instead, there was a quiet sadness for all the time they had spent postponing honesty. They thought about how many times they had almost spoken openly. How many moments they had pulled back because timing felt complicated. How often they had allowed uncertainty to make decisions on their behalf. And then came the thought they were least prepared for: perhaps you had interpreted their hesitation as indifference. That possibility stopped them. For the first time yesterday, they considered the situation from your side without immediately defending their own. What had their silence looked like to you? What had their inconsistency communicated? Had you ever wondered whether the connection mattered only to you? Had you ever stepped away because you were tired of trying to interpret mixed signals? Those questions did not create panic in your soulmate. They created accountability. There is a difference. Panic says, I must fix everything immediately. Accountability says, if I ever have the opportunity to speak honestly, I want to do better than I did before. That was the second change beginning to form. Not a reckless gesture. Not an emotional promise. A decision about how they would show up if another conversation between you became possible. They would stop hiding behind vague language. They would stop expecting you to understand feelings they had never clearly expressed. They would stop allowing other people's interpretations to become substitutes for a conversation that belonged between the two of you. Something important is waiting for you here, because the third party could not see this internal decision, yet they could see its effects. Your soulmate became strangely calm whenever your name was indirectly approached. In the past, they might have changed the subject too quickly or become visibly uncomfortable. Yesterday, they did neither. They simply listened. There was something almost settled in their expression, as though they no longer felt obligated to deny what they had already accepted privately. That calmness created more uncertainty than any dramatic reaction could have. A strong reaction can still signal inner conflict. Calm acceptance suggests the conflict may already be ending. The third party tested the old pattern gently. They brought up familiar concerns. Timing. Practicality. What other people might think. Whether revisiting something meaningful was wise. Your soulmate heard every point, but this time the arguments landed differently. They no longer treated every obstacle as proof that a feeling should be abandoned. They understood that maturity is not the absence of complexity. Sometimes maturity is simply being able to look at complexity without immediately betraying what matters to you. That understanding had grown because of you. Not because you were perfect. Not because the connection had been flawless. But because something about what you shared had shown them the difference between a relationship that asks them to perform and a connection that asks them to become more honest. And once a person recognizes that difference, it becomes difficult to forget. Then another tiny moment occurred, one the third party almost missed. Your soulmate smiled at something connected with you. It was brief, almost private. Not the smile of someone lost in fantasy. The smile of someone remembering a truth they had finally stopped fighting. That single expression told the third party more than any explanation could have. They realized your name had not become a source of chaos inside your soulmate. Somehow, it had become connected with possibility. This changed the entire dynamic. If your soulmate were still confused, outside influence might have carried weight. But clarity was making those old strategies ineffective. So the third party began asking more questions, carefully at first. Had your soulmate been speaking with you? Were they planning something? Was there more going on than they knew? Your soulmate did not give away everything because there was not yet everything to give away. This was not a secret scheme. It was something quieter and more meaningful. They were allowing themselves to consider what they genuinely wanted before announcing it to anyone else. For perhaps the first time in a long while, they were letting a decision belong to them before it belonged to the opinion surrounding them. That alone changed the balance completely. The third party had become accustomed to being consulted early. Now they were witnessing choices after those choices had already matured internally. And that is when they understood the real loss. They had not been defeated by you. You were never participating in a competition. They were being left behind by an old version of your soulmate that no longer existed. The person who constantly needed reassurance from outside was becoming someone who could sit quietly with their own truth. The person who once confused familiarity with obligation was learning that history deserves respect, but not automatic authority over the future. The person who once believed keeping everyone comfortable was kindness was discovering that genuine kindness sometimes requires clear boundaries. None of this happened because somebody won and somebody lost. It happened because your soulmate grew. And your presence had become one of the mirrors through which they recognized that growth. Stay till the end, because there is another layer that even your soulmate did not fully understand until later that evening. After the conversations were over and the noise disappeared, they imagined what they would actually say to you if you were sitting across from them. At first, their mind produced all the complicated sentences they had rehearsed before. Explanations. Reasons. Context. Everything that might justify why they had hesitated. But one by one, those sentences began feeling unnecessary. Eventually, only something simple remained: I understand more now than I did then. That was the sentence that stayed. Not, I have every answer. Not, everything will be perfect. Simply an acknowledgement that they had changed. They imagined telling you that some of the distance had taught them what closeness never could. That they had learned the cost of letting outside noise speak louder than inner truth. That they had finally recognized how unfair it can be to expect someone to wait inside uncertainty. They imagined saying that if life ever placed the two of you in an honest conversation again, they would not arrive as the same person. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of imagining what you would say back, they stopped. They realized they could not control your response. Perhaps you would welcome the conversation. Perhaps you would need time. Perhaps your own life had changed in ways they did not know. And strangely, accepting that did not weaken what they felt. It made it more sincere. Because genuine care does not demand that another person respond according to a private script. Your soulmate began understanding that loving or valuing someone means respecting their freedom too. That realization softened them. They no longer wanted to win you back as though you were something to possess. They wanted, if the opportunity ever came, to meet you honestly and see what was true between you now. That is a much quieter intention, but it is also far more mature. Meanwhile, the third party was still trying to determine what had been changed yesterday. They could see the external pieces: the altered plan, the new boundary, the calmer responses, but they could not see the most important change because it had no visible form. Your soulmate had changed the question guiding their decisions. They had stopped asking, what will keep everything exactly as it is, and started asking, what allows me to live more honestly? That single question was reorganizing everything. And once your soulmate asked it about you, an answer began surfacing that they had avoided for a long time. You mattered. Whatever happens next, whatever form the connection ultimately takes, you mattered. The experiences between you changed something. Your presence left a genuine impression. And pretending otherwise had never actually made life easier, it had merely postponed honesty. Yesterday, they finally let themselves admit this without turning it into a promise, a fantasy, or an obligation. Just truth. Simple truth. Yet somewhere between that admission and the quiet hours that followed, your soulmate made one more choice. They picked up something connected to communication. They opened it. They paused. For a few seconds, they seemed ready to do what they had postponed many times before. Then they stopped, not because they changed their mind, but because another realization entered. If they were going to take this next step, they wanted to do it differently. They did not want to send another vague message that left you wondering what they really meant. They did not want to hide a meaningful feeling inside casual words. They wanted whatever came next to carry the honesty yesterday had finally taught them. So they closed it for the moment and began thinking carefully about the first sentence. The third party knows a boundary changed. They know their old influence weakened. They know your soulmate is looking toward a future that no longer follows the familiar script. What they still do not know is that your soulmate has already begun choosing the words they may eventually use with you, and the very first thing they want you to understand has nothing to do with the third party at all. The first sentence your soulmate kept returning to was not an apology, not a confession, and not some dramatic promise about what comes next. It was much quieter than that, yet somehow it carried more weight, should have been clearer with you. Those words stayed in their mind because they finally understood that the deepest shift yesterday was not about the third party at all. It was about responsibility. Your soulmate had spent so much time trying to understand everyone else's reactions that they had rarely stopped to ask what their own uncertainty might have communicated to you. Now that question was sitting directly in front of them, and for once, they did not look away. They remembered the moments when they wanted to say more but softened the truth. They remembered conversations that could have gone deeper, yet they allowed them to end early because honesty felt too vulnerable. They remembered times when they hoped you would somehow understand what they meant without them having to risk actually saying it. And suddenly, yesterday's change became more than a boundary with someone else. It became a boundary with their own old habits. No more expecting silence to explain itself. No more letting hesitation speak louder than intention. No more allowing another person's opinion to decide what deserved to be acknowledged. That is the part the third party still cannot fully understand. They see your soulmate moving differently and assume the change must have been caused by one conversation, one discovery, one sudden emotional moment. But what they are witnessing is the result of many small realizations finally meeting at the same point. Your soulmate had been collecting evidence from their own life without realizing it. Every time they felt relieved after choosing honesty, that was evidence. Every time they remembered you after believing they had moved completely beyond the connection, that was evidence. Every time someone tried to tell them what they should feel and something inside them quietly disagreed, that was evidence too. Yesterday, all of those separate pieces formed one clear picture. They could continue living according to the version of themselves everyone expected, or they could begin listening to the person they were becoming. They chose the second. And once they did, the third party began panicking over something much deeper than a changed plan. They were confronting the possibility that your soulmate no longer needed the same permission, reassurance, or emotional direction they once depended upon. Don't skip, because the next detail is subtle, but it reveals why your presence became so important in this shift. Your soulmate did not remember you only through the biggest moments. In fact, what returned most powerfully were the details that seemed almost too small to matter. The way a certain conversation with you had felt unforced. The way you once gave them space without making that space feel like punishment. The way you listened when they were trying to explain something they barely understood themselves. Perhaps you said something simple that day, something you may not even remember now, but it stayed with them because it gave them an unfamiliar feeling. They did not have to prove their worth before being understood. Yesterday, When they compared that memory with the emotional pattern surrounding them now, they recognized the contrast immediately. Certain connections kept asking them to defend themselves. The memory of you reminded them what it felt like not to be constantly defending anything. That does not mean every moment between you was perfect. Your soulmate knows better than that now. They can see where misunderstandings existed, where timing failed, where both of you may have carried assumptions instead of questions. But maturity changed the way they looked at those imperfections. They stopped asking whether the past was flawless and started asking whether something inside it had been real enough to teach them anything. The answer was yes. It had taught them what emotional ease felt like. It had taught them how deeply being seen can matter. It had taught them that a meaningful connection does not always disappear simply because circumstances become complicated. And that realization changed the way they interpreted the third party's reaction. For a long time, your soulmate had assumed that when someone strongly disagreed with their choices, that disagreement must mean there was something wrong with the choice itself. Yesterday, they finally recognized another possibility. Sometimes resistance appears simply because your growth changes a dynamic that once benefited from your uncertainty. That realization did not make them angry. It made them careful. They started noticing how often the third party's questions were really attempts to pull them back into explanations. Are you sure? Why now? What changed? Is this really necessary? Each question sounded reasonable on its own. But your soulmate felt something different underneath them now. They felt the invitation to become uncertain again. And for the first time, they declined that invitation without needing to argue. They simply repeated what mattered: I need this to be different. Nothing more. No attack. No blame. Just clarity. That calmness unsettled the third party because the old cycle depended upon reaction. If your soulmate defended themselves, there was something to challenge. If they became emotional, there was something to redirect. If they began doubting themselves, there was room to influence them. But calm clarity gave the third party almost nothing to work with. Your soulmate was not trying to win the conversation. They were simply refusing to abandon themselves inside it. Something important is waiting for you here, because after that exchange, they thought about how differently they might have handled things with you if they had understood this earlier. They wondered whether some of the distance between you had grown because they had tried too hard to prevent discomfort rather than simply speak with honesty. They wondered whether you had watched them become vague whenever something meaningful approached the surface. Perhaps you felt the connection and then watched them step backward from it. Perhaps that left you questioning your own interpretation. Your soulmate finally understood how confusing that might have been. Instead of criticizing themselves endlessly, however, they made a quieter decision: if another meaningful conversation ever happens, they will not make you carry the burden of guessing. That promise was not made to you yet. It was made privately, inside them. But it was perhaps the most important promise of yesterday. Stay till the end, because the third party eventually noticed one particular behavior they had never expected. Your soulmate stopped correcting people when your name was mentioned in ways that minimized what you had meant. In the past, they might have laughed something off, changed the subject, or agreed with a simplified version of the story simply because it was easier than explaining the truth. Yesterday, they could no longer do that comfortably. When someone casually reduced your connection to something insignificant, your soulmate became quiet. Not offended. Not defensive. Just unwilling to participate in the rewriting of their own experience. That silence carried a message. The third party recognized it immediately. They realized your soulmate was beginning to protect not only their future choices but also the truth of their past. And once someone stops allowing others to define what a meaningful connection meant to them, outside influence becomes much weaker. The third party tried one more time to frame the situation as though your soulmate were simply nostalgic. But even that interpretation no longer fit. Nostalgia looks backward because it misses what once was. Your soulmate was doing something different. They were using the past to understand what they wanted to create differently in the future. They were not asking to repeat everything exactly as it happened. They were asking whether the qualities they valued, honesty, peace, emotional openness, mutual respect, could exist more intentionally next time. And yes, when they pictured those qualities, thoughts of you appeared. That was why the old explanations no longer satisfied them. They could tell themselves they had moved on from a chapter, but the lessons from that chapter were still guiding the person they were becoming. At some point later that evening, your soulmate opened the unfinished message again. The screen looked exactly the same, yet they did not. They read the few words they had typed, deleted them, and started over. Not because the first words were false, but because they sounded too much like the old version of them, careful enough to avoid vulnerability, vague enough to escape responsibility. This time they wanted something cleaner. There's something I understand now that I didn't understand then. They stared at the sentence for a while. It felt closer. It did not demand anything from you. It did not assume your response. It simply opened a door toward honesty. But even then, they hesitated. Your soulmate realized that if they ever reached toward you, the message could not only be about their own relief. It had to respect whatever your life had become too. You may have changed. You may have found new peace. You may have learned boundaries of your own. You may no longer be waiting for an explanation that once felt necessary. Recognizing that did not discourage them. It humbled them. They understood that sincerity is not measured by whether another person gives you the answer you hope for. It is measured by whether you can speak truthfully while still honoring their freedom. That realization separated this moment from everything that came before. Your soulmate was no longer preparing to communicate because they could not tolerate uncertainty. They were preparing because they finally understood that leaving meaningful things permanently unspoken can sometimes create more confusion than speaking gently and respectfully. The third party sensed some of this change without seeing the message itself. Your soulmate became more protective of their phone, but not in a secretive or suspicious way. More like someone who was no longer willing to let every private thought become public discussion. They began taking their time before responding to questions. They stopped allowing conversations to be rushed. They even seemed less interested in hearing predictions about what you might do or think. I don't know what they would say, your soulmate admitted internally, and maybe I'm not supposed to know until I actually listen. That thought changed another pattern. For too long, they had allowed other people to speak for you in their imagination. Someone would say, they probably think this. Another would insist, they would never understand that. Someone else might speculate about your intentions, and your soulmate would absorb those guesses because asking you directly seemed more difficult. Yesterday, they realized how unfair that was. Nobody else gets to narrate your inner world. If there is ever going to be clarity between you, it cannot come through a third party interpreting both sides. It has to come through honest conversation. That is when the third party's position weakened in the most significant way yet. Not because your soulmate suddenly rejected them as a human being, but because they stopped treating that person as an interpreter of you. Imagine how powerful that shift is. The third party could still have opinions. They could still express concerns. They could still believe whatever they believed. But those opinions no longer had the authority to become your voice. Your soulmate finally separated the two. That is what they think, they realized, but it does not mean that is what you think. The moment they understood that distinction, an entire layer of confusion disappeared. Suddenly, the questions they had been carrying felt simpler. If they wanted to know what you felt, only you could answer. If they wanted to know whether the connection still had meaning, that could only be discovered through authenticity, not assumptions. If they wanted to know whether anything could be rebuilt, neither memory nor outside advice could decide that. Only two people, showing up honestly in the present, could discover it. That thought gave your soulmate an unexpected sense of peace. The future no longer needed to be predicted. It simply needed to be approached with integrity. And something inside them relaxed. The third party noticed this peace and misunderstood it as confidence that everything would go your soulmate's way. But that was not it. Your soulmate had become peaceful because they finally accepted that they could control only their own honesty. Your answer would belong to you. The timing would belong to life. The outcome would emerge from reality, not fantasy. Their responsibility was simply to stop hiding behind fear. That is why yesterday changed so much. Your soulmate had not suddenly gained certainty about everything. They had gained something more useful, the courage to live without needing certainty before being truthful. And once they reached that point, the third party could no longer use uncertainty as a reason for keeping everything frozen. The old argument "you don't know what will happen, so do nothing" lost its power. Of course your soulmate did not know what would happen. Nobody does. But they finally understood that uncertainty is not always a warning. Sometimes it is simply the natural space between an honest choice and whatever comes next. Later, they returned to the message for a third time. This time, they wrote more. Not pages. Not a dramatic speech. Just enough to acknowledge what they had learned. They wrote about seeing certain things differently. They wrote about regretting the moments when silence may have created confusion. They wrote about not wanting to make assumptions about where you are now. And then they reached the sentence that made them stop completely. It was the sentence they had avoided for longer than any other: "You mattered to me more than I knew how to say." Their fingers became still. Not because the sentence felt wrong. Because it felt exact. It did not promise a future that had not happened. It did not rewrite the past as perfect. It did not make you responsible for their growth. It simply acknowledged something real. You mattered. The connection mattered. The lessons mattered. And all the time spent minimizing that truth had not made it disappear. For several moments, your soulmate considered sending the message exactly as it was. Then another thought entered, and this is where the next part of the story begins to turn. They realized there was one final thing they needed to change before reaching toward you, not in the message, not in their schedule, not in their relationship with the third party, but inside the way they viewed themselves. Because your soulmate had finally understood what they wanted to say to you. What they had not yet understood was whether they truly believed they deserved to say it. And somewhere deep in that quiet question was the last piece of yesterday's transformation, the piece that would determine whether those carefully chosen words remained on a screen, or finally became something you could hear.